Hello, and welcome to this week's episode of Art Like Everything Else, the podcast where we use art to talk about literally everything else. This week, I want to talk about what ingratiating ourselves with grief might actually look like. And to do just that, I'm going to be using two works of art. I'm your host, Mo. Let's get right into today's conversation. First work of art is going to be the short film Weathering, released on Netflix in April of 2023. This short film was written and directed by I want to make sure I say this correctly. Megalyn Echikunanwoke, and it's 20 minutes long. It's a really, really good short film. It's a thriller, so if you're a fan of thrillers, I highly recommend it. It's beautifully shot and all around like very intriguing, and it kept me sort of on the edge of my seat to see like what all was really happening. Now, kind of like all other works of art in my podcast, when it comes to discussing briefly about the show, movie, song, or whatever, I'm going to talk about it because it's a part of today's conversation. But in case you would like to watch it without any spoilers, I'm going to read you the description of it via IMDb. So the description of this movie via IMDb is read as follows. After losing her baby and nearly her life during labor, a journalist unravels amid disturbing visions and chilling attacks as she grieves alone at home. And so that's the description, and it's a pretty apt description of what is taking place in the short film. The short film is only 20 minutes. I highly recommend it. So if you even want to like pause this or watch it and come back, feel free to do so. This short film is rated mature, and there are going to be some themes that do require a trigger warning. So trigger warning for Black maternal health and death, child deaths, and medical neglect. And so with that being said, if that is still something you are open to watching and looking at, I do still think the short film was really good, and I do recommend it. But also, I completely understand if it's too much to watch, because we'll see, even for me, it was a bit overwhelming to kind of see the neglect happening on screen in that regard. With that being said, jumping into today's conversation regarding this particular work of art. So in Weathering, we are seeing Jamina, that's the name of our main character, we're seeing her being stalked almost by this figure after she's been released from the hospital and she's trying to get on with her life. And she is doing her best to make it day by day. You see her trying to rush back into getting into like back to who she used to be and trying to be who she was prior to this experience physically and mentally, but often you see her also struggling with that just not being the case. So she's a journalist and you see her struggling to write and to meet deadlines as she usually would be expected to. And there's just this really big all around, almost like cloud, because she also feels like there also seems to be someone sort of stalking her. And she wakes up with these scars and she finds herself being like physically harmed. And we don't get to see the face of this particular attacker. And it's just overall overwhelming and distressful. And then you see her having to deal with other people and try to engage as she would normally, but it's not the same. She's terrified, she's grief-stricken, and so much is happening around her, and it's all around overwhelming. And then we see so much more happen, and we realize that maybe ingratiating ourselves with the grief we are feeling is the only way through that particular grief. And I want to talk about that more in our conversation today. But first, we're going to talk about our second work of art. So let's get right into our second work of art. So for our second work of art, we have another short film. So this short film is called Ostinato, and it was also released in 2023, just a little bit later in the year. So this was released in November 2023, and it was directed by Sonia Furier and written by Sunita Balsara. And it's actually inspired by the writer's own personal experience, and it's an animated short film, and so I'm a really big fan of animation, and so that's also why this sort of stuck out to me, but I also felt like it aligned with today's conversation. The short film is only about 7 minutes, and I highly recommend it. It's a really short watch. You can also find this on Netflix, and it's really beautiful. I really, really enjoy it, and so I'm going to read you the description before I talk about it because it's a short film and it's literally only 7 minutes. It's going to be pretty impossible to not give any spoilers on such a short film. So I highly recommend you watch it, especially if you want to see just all the beauty of it. There's so many great colors and there's so many like stylizations in the short film that like it just is beautiful. I've watched it multiple times already. But yes, so the short film is called Ostinato, released in 2023. There is a version, there is another short film called Ostinato released in 2025. That is not the one I'm talking about. Ostinato, animated short film, released in 2023. This short film, according to IMDb, the description is read as follows. Inspired by writer Sunita Balsara's experience with tinnitus, Ostinato follows Nuha, a composer who sees the world as a vibrant soundscape. She is having the best and gentlest kind of morning when her playing is interrupted by a mysterious tone. As he struggles to confine and banish it, the tone grows larger and louder, drowning out her music. Only when Nuha stops fighting does she discover a way to incorporate the tone into her music and life. So, with that being said, I do again highly recommend watching this short film. It's beautiful. It's 7 minutes, and I'm going to talk about it a bit more and how it relates to today's conversation. So, in this short film, we do see Nuha going about her morning, and she's having her coffee. She's looking out the window. She's just seeing and embracing and enjoying all the beauty that is around her and all the ways in which it is sort of connected. And then this sort of tone that's like really high pitched finds its way into her apartment while she's getting ready to practice and while she's looking and trying to see the beauty of everything that is around her. There's this sort of incessant tone that keeps almost like interrupting everything that it is she will usually be doing in the morning. And so we see her doing her best to get rid of this tone because she think it's like by hiding it, maybe hiding it from the light or preventing it from being seen almost would make this tone disappear. And so she's covering of all access to light that would make that she feels is what's feeding this tone. And she's trying to get rid of it. And in trying to get rid of it, she's almost making a mess of everything else. And it seems like everything else around her starts to fall apart. And then she comes to terms and she realizes that maybe trying to get rid of this tone isn't what's necessary for her to keep going. And I want to elaborate so much more on that. And I will do just that in our conversation. So let's have today's conversation. So, for today's conversation, I really want to talk about ingratiating ourselves with grief. For those who do not know, the word ingratiate per Merriam-Webster's dictionary is as follows: to gain favor or favorable acceptance for by deliberate effort. So, it is usually used with the word with, so like ingratiate ourselves with grief. And I think this is really important. And we see this in both of our works of art today. But so often, grief is something we want to avoid. Grief is something, and even just like grief around like setbacks and all of these other things around life are things meant to be pushed through and gotten over and more or less ignored. And that is just not the reality of life. It's simply not ever going to be a reality of life. And grief in and of itself is something we do have to find ourselves coming to terms with and making peace with. And we see this in both Weathering, and we also see it in Ostinato. In Weathering, we find out this person that has been stalking Jamina this entire time, that has been harming her and almost not even pretty much, but quite literally attacking her physically, is herself. We find out that she is quite literally at arms with herself about all that it is she has experienced, and like this battle with herself and with her grief, this physical representation of her grief, is what's preventing her from feeling like she can open herself up again to new relationships, feeling like she can meet her deadlines for her job and do her job and be a considerable host for like when people visit or when people want to be around. Like she doesn't feel like she can open up and be that person again. And it isn't until she comes to terms with and faces her grief, this physical representation of her, that she's like, actually, I do have to do things that makes it possible for me to keep going. And she becomes one with this grief, and things start to go smoother afterwards. And then we also see this in Ostinato, in which I sort of interpret it like this grief and this difficulty being like represented by that literal tone that it's like impossible for Nua to escape from. And we see her trying to hide it away, keep it out of the light, and keep going on like everything's normal and everything's the same, and it's not. Your life is not the same when it comes to grief. Your life is irreparably different, and there is no going back to how things used to be. And so we see her after everything sort of falling down and she feels hopeless about what's going to keep happening or what's going to happen next. This tone comes back, and she realizes that maybe if she incorporates this tone into her work, maybe things will be easier. And we see that it does become easier. We see that everything starts to more or less everything starts to sound like music again for her, because that's a really, really big theme for her in this short film. And for those who don't know, ostinato is actually a musical term for like a pattern or melody that's played at the exact same pitch. And we see that like while she's trying to avoid this, it's escaping and it's navigating and it's moving all around and it's staying just out of her reach, while it's making everything else around her fall out of tune and out of sync with what was we saw before. And it isn't until everything sort of falls apart in her trying to avoid letting this tone show up and interrupt what it is she's used to having. It isn't until we see how it's interrupted everything and she's now down and hopeless and unmotivated, that when she sees when this tone returns, because the tone never actually disappeared, when this tone returns, because she's seeing it through a different lens now, she's seeing it through this lens of grief as well. It's like she realizes that there is a way to make music with this tone as well, that maybe she can ingratiate herself with this tone and ingratiate this tone and combine it with the music and the beauty of life that she's been seeing prior to. So that's what I mean by ingratiating ourselves with grief. It is so easy for grief to be like this thing you consider to be separate from you and not a part of your quite literal life experience, and quite literally as an extension of yourself, because you do not want that grief. A lot of people see grief as the reminder of the loss and grief as a reminder of what no longer exists. And it can be that, but I do think grief can be a both and situation. And so kind of like a few weeks back, I talked about briefly about how I've been wanting to look at the positive side of fear. And that is something I've been doing with a lot of the other quote unquote negative emotions, is trying to see what it is that grief tells you. So, like with that episode, I talked about trying to figure out what it is that fear will tell me about myself. And I do the same with all, try to do the same with all other quote unquote negative emotions. And grief is no different. And so it's like, try to think about what it is grief is telling you. And so grief is often emotions that come up as a result of loss or of things denied. So, like experiences, realities, and things of that nature. But I try to focus on, or I try to, what I like to think about is thinking about the desire aspect of it. So, I may be grieving, let's say I'm Jamina, I'm grieving the loss of relationships, the loss of a child, and also grieving the reality of what it is to be a Black woman in the medical, like in medical neglect, and just how rampant that is. And I think what that grief can tell you is that, like, she absolutely wanted those. She wanted that child. She wanted to be happy, and she wanted to experience the joy, especially with her partner, of being a parent, of being a family. Because in this film, we see all of these photos that sort of are like reminiscing of her being literally excited about what was to come, only for those dreams and desires to sort of be crushed by the medical neglect. And I think if we can focus on, like, I am capable of love and desire, and that's what this grief showed me, that's the way we can sort of ingratiate ourselves with our grief. We can come to terms with, like, all the things that grief tells us and shows us is important for us, and find beauty in that. And I just think that's beautiful. And also, we sort of see it literally happening in Ostinato when this tone, which I'm taking to represent grief, is quite literally woven into and used to make really beautiful music by Nuha, our main character. And so it's really important that we not only allow ourselves to grieve, which is very, very important, allow ourselves to feel the full range of our humanity, but also to not deny ourselves this grief, and to ingratiate ourselves and allow it to show us other things about ourselves. So, like, we know that grief happens because of a loss. And, like, I know there's this popular quote that sort of going around online that, and I can't remember who started the quote, but I do kind of just want to get through this episode. So the quote, I believe it goes, grief is just love with nowhere to go. And you can think of it that way. I'm not saying you can't, but I think grief is also proof that love existed. And it doesn't have to be that it's love with nowhere to go, but it can also only be that proof that love existed. So, like, for Jamina specifically, her grief came from the fact that, like, she loved and really desired that family that she was growing with her then partner. And even just knowing that it was proof that that love existed, if that's all that grief can be for her, I think that is enough. And I think it doesn't have to be more than that. But for me, I think grief is simply proof that love existed, or that desire existed, and that is enough in and of itself. And so maybe, just maybe, ingratiating ourselves with our grief too can be an art. An art like everything else. Last and certainly not least is this week's awe moment. So for this week's awe moment, I'm actually going to be revisiting a interview that I actually referenced in my very first season of this very podcast. So in this podcast, Art Like Everything Else, the podcast, there was an episode about grief and the inevitability of bad. That's the name of that's the title of the episode. And it's an interview between Stephen Colbert and Anderson Cooper, and they're talking about grief because Anderson Cooper, he recently, as far as this episode was happening, so this episode was 6 years ago. So in this episode, Anderson Cooper talking about losing his parents, and also Stephen Colbert is talking about losing his dad and brothers very young, and then also talking about what it was like to also lose his mom in her old age and all of those things. And there's so much understanding and really cool quotables and pullables from this interview alone. And a lot of it is this entire interview, more or less, I feel encapsulates exactly what I mean by ingratiating ourselves with our grief. And so Anderson Cooper talks quite literally about how he feels like this grief that he has for his mother that he's been experiencing, it feels like a literal, like an extra arm, like an extension of himself. And grief absolutely does feel like that for a lot of people. And even if we don't recognize it, I do feel like grief has always been and will always be an extension of our beings, because once it happens and once it shows up, it doesn't go away, and we never become the people we were before that happened. And so it becomes this extension of ourselves. And he talks about how he feels like the person he was before his grief and the person he was after his grief, especially so like he also lost a parent pretty young. And so he talks about how he feels like he's noticed or believes that there is a difference between who he was prior to the grief and who he was after that grief. And Stephen Colbert also sort of commiserates with him on that part and is like, hey, I agree. Like, there's who I was before losing my brother and my dad is different than who I was after that happened. And the relationship I had with my mom was also changed, and it was not the same as it was before, and the same with Anderson Cooper. And I think a really, really beautiful outlook that Stephen Colbert has taken when it comes to this is that, like, he says what gift, well, he didn't say it, it's a quote from Tolkien, but Anderson Cooper is sort of reminding Stephen Colbert of a reference to a quote he said, in which he's like, what punishments of God are not gifts? And Stephen Colbert is like, yes, I do agree, and I do believe that. And I have also come to believe that. I do think sometimes it is very, very easy to only reflect on that grief aspect. So, like, referencing back to today's episode with Austin, with Ostinato and Nua, in which she, like, in the beginning, we see her so focused on trying to get rid of or hide and keep this tone that's interrupting everything for her out of the light, that it quite literally, it makes everything else sort of devolve around her. And then we also see with Jamina how she is quite literally unable to function normally as a result of her grief. There's so often times we want to deny and get rid of and avoid what quite literally is inevitable, and not only inevitable, but can be a gift that maybe we've not yet realized. And so, like, Stephen Colbert, he's talking about how in it quite literally it is a gift to exist. It's a gift to exist, in that, like, in his grief, in these punishments of God that he's experienced, he's been able to find things he enjoys. Like, he talks about how he thought that he got into comedy for the most part for his mother as a result of this grief, because he felt like he had to do something to keep his mother happy. He met people and he was able to relate to them on some very, very terrible experiences around grief. He was able to relate to them and provide and be a part of community or just this group of understanding what it feels like and just how terrible it feels like to lose a parent, to lose siblings, to lose someone who's really, really important to you, and to feel like you have no one to talk to about that. He was able to be someone who understood that experience for other people, allowing for that connection. And he was able to do this as a result of these punishments by God. And so I think it's really important that we do begin to not only make peace with grief, but ingratiate ourselves with our grief and be okay with that being an extension of ourselves and walking alongside that grief and not avoiding it. And so, yeah, that's all I have for today's episode. Feel free to like, follow, subscribe, and download today's episode if you're listening to it on Spotify or any other like podcast platform. Also, what was I about to say? If you like to follow me on the social medias, TikTok, Instagram, and Twitter, you can find me at The Lovely Infinite. That is TheLvlyInfinite. And so you can find that. I'll also have it on the screen. Also, for my Art Like Studios, feel free to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Art Like Studios. I do also have a art collective. I do have an art collective, and feel free to join that. Am still working through a bit of the fear aspect, and I absolutely positively intend to get more on that. And thank you for your patience with me, and thank you for being here today and for following along on this podcast. I appreciate every single one of my listeners and viewers. And yeah, thank you for listening. Thank you for being. Have a great rest of your day. Bye. Megalyn Echikunwanwoke.
Megalyn Echikunwoke.